not so bad.
That's not so bad.
Hello everyone, thank you for joining us. As Scott said, I am Nico Ascari, the FT's digital markets correspondent, and I'm joined here by a wonderful panel to discuss the hottest topic really of the day, the week, the year, US regulation and the road to regulatory clarity. I'm joined here by Calvert, Head of US Policy at Coinbase, Christopher Giancarlo, Executive Chairman at the Digital Dollar Project, Senior Counsel at Willkie, Farr and Gallagher, and former Chairman of the CFTC, and Michael Piwowar, Executive Vice President of Finance at the Milken Institute. Well, thank you all for joining us. The only place really to start, Cara, is, with the SEC's lawsuit against Coinbase. Can you lay out what you make of it and what your position is?
Absolutely. So as all of you know, we were served a Wells notice earlier this year and then followed by a lawsuit. And I think what we have discovered through that is we have spent years trying to work with the SEC and to develop a regulatory path and go through all of the very technical questions about how you make a regulation work. This isn't the first time it's happened. We've seen it through swaps. We've seen it through all sorts of different assets. This isn't the first time they've had to make adjustments and modernize systems, but it's been really difficult to do in this instance. And so the lawsuit followed many meetings over years, actually, going back to when some of these gentlemen were actually in the administration. So we've had a long history of that, and I think it was the culmination of really just the inability to find common ground on it. And now I think what we are seeing, though, is we are still asking for the same thing. It hasn't really changed our approach to Washington, which is we still need clear rules. We need rules of the road for the whole industry, not just one-off enforcement actions that create only a pathway for one or two players, but really create rules for the whole industry and for consumers. I think that's the things that keeps getting lost, is that it's really about investors countrywide, consumers countrywide, and giving them consistent rules. So our playbook hasn't really changed in Washington. We'll continue to do the work in terms of policy development and working with Congress, but now the courts are involved.
I mean, on that, and then Brian mentioned it earlier as well, what have you done in the past sort of 2 weeks since the lawsuit? What is the plan going forward in terms of court action?
Right, so thankfully I don't see my chief legal officer out there anywhere. He would be the one best suited to answer the questions about the specifics on the legalities. In terms of US policy, though, and how we're working, we'll continue to determine how best market structure might work in registration, how we think about issuer assets, and we're going to continue to have those conversations both inside the building with the agency and with policymakers in Congress and across the states.
I mean, the core issue here really is the issue of tokens as securities. I'll start with you and then work the way down. What is your argument in that argument?
Right, so I think there are issues around tokenized securities versus crypto-native assets and how we actually bring crypto-native assets on board in a way that represents a security or some sort of equity stake. And I think that those definitions, and I would definitely turn to people who are the lawyers on the table, or on the panel, and actually have more experience on this. But for us, it's really finding a pathway for both tokenization and for assets that are coming on board who really need to understand how they register, why they register. If it's a utility token, if it acts like a commodity, they shouldn't be registering in the first place. So I think it's finding that bright line.
Okay, Chris?
This whole divide between securities and commodities, it's purely a US divide. It doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. It's because the way we've decided to conduct market oversight in the United States with two different agencies and this legal artificial divide. Other countries harmonize those within usually one regulator, one body of laws. So this is our problem, and we're still trying to work our way through it years after this started. I had the pleasure of sitting beside Cara's chief legal officer, Paul Graywall, 2 weeks ago in Washington at a hearing of the House Ag Committee that was taking up a legislative a way to address these issues and better define which agency has what part of this jump ball. And I began my testimony by saying, 5 years ago, almost to this month, I was on the other side of Capitol Hill in front of the Senate, asking the Senate to put forward a comprehensive regulatory scheme for digital assets. And that was 5 years, and still we're still caught up in our underwear arguing over which agency has got which piece of what is an entirely new architecture of finance and banking and money itself. And we are really at risk of falling behind the rest of the world, which is moving forward with those frameworks embracing this new innovation in a sensible way with proper investor protections, but yet moving forward in the face of this new innovation. We are doing this entirely backwards the way we did it 25 years ago when we absolutely did the first wave of the internet 100% right by embracing it and doing a do no harm approach to it. This time around, we're doing it exactly wrong. We're resisting this innovation, and by resisting it, we're not influencing it. Others are going to have a much greater influence. Our economic competitors, our economic adversaries can have much greater influence on this because of the resistance we're putting up to this innovation, fighting over things about what's a security and what's a commodity.
Yeah, Chris is absolutely right, and there needs to be a legislative fix, right? So the title is regulatory clarity. I mean, the SEC has given regulatory clarity, which is the beatings will continue until morale improves. But there really is not a regulatory fix. To Chris's point, we need to think more of a legislative fix, and we need to be more creative. In the meantime, what the Commission, the SEC, is sort of stuck with is the same lenses that they've used to determine whether something's a security. The Reeves test, the Howey test, a bunch of other things. And when I was at the Commission, we issued something called a 21A report. That was almost 6 years, it'd be 6 years ago next month. That is the last time the SEC, as the Commission, has actually spoken about digital assets. And what we said in that Dow report was that for that particular token that was involved in that we were going to use the Howey test. Now, a couple points on that. That was actually an initial coin offering, right? And ICOs were arguably about capital raising. Now, I say arguably because it turned out at that time, what we were hearing from outside counsels at different law firms was that greater than 90% of these things were just outright fraud, right? So the SEC has to balance three parts of its mission. Two of them are investor protection and capital formation. Sometimes you have to make choices about which way you want to lean on either of those two. And it's very easy for us to lean very heavily on the investor protection side on that one, and we're able to clean up the market in terms of initial coin offerings. But if you look at that Dow report, it says we're going to use the Howey test because of that specific facts and circumstances involved in that. What it was a distributed autonomous organization that was using money to fund different, they called them projects, but if you think about it, it was sort of like little miniature companies and stuff, and they were going to get paid out of the earnings of that. That was clearly a security. Since then, we've had all kinds of innovation. To Chris's point, in this industry, and they're still left with just the Howey test. They need a new architecture to do it, and they keep bending and bending and bending on this. And we can talk more about the different pieces of that, but totally agree with Chris on that.
I mean, on your point about the Howey test, what is the way forward if not the Howey test?
Yeah, I mean, the one, there's multiple paths forwards on that to continue on that, right? So some of the firms are getting caught up in the, right? So it's an investment of money in a common enterprise with the expectation of profit solely due to the efforts of others. It's not like I have the 4 prongs memorized, right? But the one prong that seems to trip people up is in a common enterprise, right? And that's why Chairman Gensler has said, well, Bitcoin is not because it's decentralized. There's questions about whether Ethereum, when it began, was, but probably now is not, given the decentralized nature of that and how that sort of goes. And then you've got, SEC Commissioner Hester Peirce has pointed out, well, that's not fair to folks that want to issue new ones. They can't quite get past that first test. How do you get from a centralized piece to a decentralized piece? And there's a couple different ways you could go. One is you can have something defined as a security, and then over time it becomes a commodity. You can sort of think about it that way. Commissioner Peirce has put forward her safe harbor proposal, which says, look, let's give time-limited safe harbor under certain conditions and certain good faith, that until it becomes decentralized. It's a security, but it's maybe under the Howey test, but we're under certain conditions we'll allow it to then become decentralized and then be regulated as a commodity from there. So there's a couple of different paths forward you can think about.
Can I just jump in here? A minute ago I talked about we have these two different agencies. It's a uniquely American situation. They do actually have different purposes. So the SEC oversees markets for capital formation. The CFTC oversees markets for risk transfer and risk mitigation. And those have served the United States very well. We have the biggest capital markets in the world. We have the biggest risk transfer markets in the world. And I think part of the reason is because they have bespoke regulators. They do things differently. The SEC focuses a lot on investor protection, has other approaches that it takes that are unique to it. The CFTC does things differently, oversees mostly wholesale markets, so it doesn't have some of the same investor protection elements to it. And so if you put it in that context, think about what we're talking about here. We're talking about some legal framework that divides digital assets, not only how they divide them, but the result of that is they go under one agency or another, and by going over the one agency, they then get the things that come with that agency. They get the investor protection chops, or at the CFTC, they get the innovation chops that the CFTC is very good at. Is that really how we should be going about digital assets? Or should we come up with a whole scheme that says, put all that other stuff aside, what do digital assets require a priority in a holistic way? And therefore, it's not so much who do we assign it to, is what substantive protection should be built for digital assets, and then decide which of the alphabet soup of Washington agencies are better placed to provide those benefits. I think we're going at this all backwards. We're fighting over which agency gets it without then getting into, well, what does that then mean? In terms of, I think we should need to look at this holistically in the way the Europeans are, the way the Brits are. We need to start from the point about what's unique about this new technology, these new digital assets, and then what's the right regulatory framework to put it in. And lastly, then decide which of the various regulators should have that responsibility, and hopefully with the right funding to go with it to do the job.
Do you think anyone is thinking about it like that, or is it sort of too far down the argument path now to be?
Well, unfortunately, like everything else, it's fallen into Washington politics. So I do think there's a lot of sensible thinking. I think these bills that have been introduced, they're not perfect, but they do evidence a lot of thought and intelligent thinking. There's a real will to get something done, and yet we've got politics in the middle of it. At that very hearing where I sat beside Coinbase's chief legal officer, they were sued that morning. I mean, I can tell you, having run an agency, you decide when that happens, right? That is not a random, the number popped up that morning, out went the lawsuit. That was deliberate. And that's politics. And it's unfortunate that that's when we're trying to navigate our way through a new innovation that's going to revolutionize finance globally. And we, as the leader of the 20th century financial marketplace, are arguing politics as we're going into the 21st and its new digital architecture. It's really unfortunate. We need to get beyond this like a mature country does and decide what's the right way to handle this new innovation and get out in front of it, not try to fight it from behind.
I was going to pick up on the theme, though, that I do think it really is important that Congress engages here, because the agencies by nature are generally forced to actually work together in most instances, because they have different missions, they have different important mandates, and so generally it takes Congress to tell them that they need to work together on something. And also, it's really incumbent on Congress to actually determine the policy and the trajectory of the country, not agency heads and not individual people, individual staff. And so for them, I think there's this real perception that the agencies not only are having a turf war, but that they're picking winners and losers. And I think that that's the challenge and why Congress is engaging. I think that there has been a lot of thought put into how do we create a system that recognizes the diversity of different assets, because some are very clearly securities. Some are very clearly commodities. And then there's a whole range in between. And so we have to have a system that creates some flexibility in an ideal world. 2 years ago, maybe we were ahead of our time, Coinbase put out a digital asset policy proposal that called for that, a new regulatory regime for the life cycle of a digital asset. And we had Congress people laugh at us and say that that's crazy. We can't create an entirely new agency, or we can't put all of this in one agency. And so we're kind of stuck with the system we have. And so we have to figure out at what point does it go into the SEC, and what are the important roles of the SEC in doing that, because we do need investor protection, but we also need to make sure that we provide the pathway for innovation. And even though that's not the mandate of the SEC, it sure would be nice if they'd take it into consideration sometimes.
In Congress, there needs to be a sense of urgency for a couple of reasons. One, the international regulators are moving forward, right? And we have the largest, most deepest, most transparent, resilient capital markets in the world. We're going to lose out on the innovation that comes with the digital asset space that's going on. The other reason why there's a sense of urgency is because particularly the SEC, my old agency, is not waiting around to actually do formal regulation. They're doing regulation by enforcement, right? And it's not just Coinbase or Bittrex or some of these, they're saying, well, you're an unregistered securities exchange because you're trading unregistered securities. And then in the complaint, they name several tokens that the SEC is saying are asserting are securities. I've talked to two of these issuers of these tokens, and they've never had any conversations with the SEC about whether or not they were securities or not. So it's not just the intermediaries that are being damaged by the regulation by enforcement, but it's also the collateral damage by these token issuers. And then the more important one is the unseen. It's the people who aren't issuing potentially innovative things in the future that aren't getting off the ground because they're afraid that they're going to be wrapped up in one of these lawsuits.
This story about the innovators, and so sorry to cut you off. It's so important because that's where the jobs are going to come from. That's where the developers, that's where the knock-on effects of having new innovation in the country are really going to come from. While Coinbase can help facilitate the growth and the accessibility of the ecosystem, the developers are the job creators. And so when we go to places like Ohio, we had an event there a couple of weeks ago, and we had all of these, we had 60 people show up that were innovators, builders, startups, people who care deeply about the crypto economy. And it was fascinating to see because that, I think, is those are the people who are going to miss out. We will continue, they'll have to go overseas, and Coinbase will continue to fight the fight, but that's where we're going to see the lack or the gap, maybe a 2-year to 3-year gap.
Absolutely. And they will go overseas. In this, one of the elements of this technology is borderless. It will like water flowing around a dam. You push up this side, it'll just flow around the edge, and that's exactly what's happening. In the last 6 months, I've met with financial market regulators from Brazil to Japan, Singapore, and the UK, and they see, the Chinese actually have a phrase for it. I can't say it in Chinese, but it means passing on the curve, and it's a racing term. When cars or horses go into the curve, they tend to slow down. The ones who are willing to take the risk of going around, that's often where the pass takes place. They see the United States breaking for the curve, and this is their opportunity to go around us in every way, and that's exactly what's happening. The EU's doing it, Britain's doing it, and they're very aware of our confusion right now, and they see it as an opportunity.
I mean, on your point, on all those points, but on your point, Cara, about the innovators, and that's the gap, and those are the people that are losing out. We've got an audience question saying, obviously Coinbase is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, exchanges, crypto companies in the US, but how can other industry participants who aren't at your size and scale, and how can they make their voices heard? I mean, I know you're sort of leading this charge and fighting with the SEC, but how can the others do that?
Absolutely. So actually, I didn't know that there was going to be a QR code on here. Click on the QR code, that's one way. So that is our effort. About 4 months ago, we created an organization called Crypto 435. It was designed with the idea in mind that there are 435 congressional districts. We wanted to see if we could find one person in every congressional district that cared about crypto. We blew that out of the water within the first month. Within the first week, we had somebody in every single congressional district that cared about crypto. Within the first month, we had 30,000 people who'd signed up, and then 40,000, and we're nearing 50,000. And then we decided to take it on chain with this idea of stand with crypto, mint an NFT. And we have seen that eclipse way over almost 200,000 now in terms of people engaging on chain. So what we're trying to do is make sure that everyday Americans, again, people who care and use crypto, but also the people who are developers and building are reaching out to Congress, reaching out the SEC. I mean, they're less susceptible, and I think you all can validate that, less susceptible to the political pressures of constituencies calling and saying, please write rules. But the members of Congress care deeply about their constituencies, and it's getting engaged, and it's actually showing up at events like we had in Columbus last week. It's showing up in places like New York. We've done it in Albany. We're doing them across the country. So it's showing up and talking to your policymaker and telling them why, frankly, why it matters to you and why sorry to all the lawyers in the room, but when you're an innovator, it's not a fun thing to have your second or third or fourth hire be a lawyer, and generally an expensive lawyer, because there aren't a lot of people who know this policy inside and out, because it's complicated and it's new.
And I've seen statistics, you probably know these better than I do, that something like 1 in 8 American adults own crypto.
1 in 5.
But it's 1 in 5, I think, voters, likely voters own crypto.
Yep.
So it's a very engaged audience that are going to speak louder increasingly.
Yep.
And the 1 in 5, I learned that actually from Brian Armstrong, was the one who said that either bought, sold, or have interacted with crypto through video games or other sorts of things. It skews young, and they're in every congressional district, to your point. So members of Congress, there's sort of three buckets, remember. There's sort of the pro-crypto, the anti-crypto, and then the ones that were either skeptical or just too busy with other things. That middle group is the one that is starting to hear from their constituents, and they're starting to hear from the young constituents. Interestingly, they're also starting to hear it from their staffers. So we spend, at the Milken Institute, my day job, we spend a lot of time educating policymakers on various aspects, and we're always thinking about the fact that members of Congress, 50, 60, 70 years old, know the issues. It's the 25, 30-year-old staffer that we're educating. In crypto, it's the reverse. It's the 25, 30-year-old staffer knows this stuff, right? They have Coinbase on their phone. They're very comfortable with doing this. It's the 50, 60, 70-year-old member of Congress, and it's a different language we need to use in order to get through and to do that. But it's the younger people that are starting to push.
You know, I'll reveal my age. I came of age in the late 60s, early 70s, and there was a concept called the generation gap then. It was, you know, our parents and certainly our grandparents just didn't understand a younger generation's concern over social issues like the war in Vietnam and civil rights. And they never did. They just eventually left the stage and younger people grew into those positions. I feel we're in the same generation gap today, but that generation gap is over technology and a networked world. And with great respect to the septuagenarians and gerontocracy, as some people call it, that are running things today, they didn't grow up in a network world. They grew up in a world of branch banking and 3-day settlement and, you know, and expensive ability to move money around the world. And to them, it's just fine. And they're not going to actually come around to this, but they will just leave the stage, and what will replace them will be people that grew up in a networked world that intuitively understand this. That's why I'm certain that this innovation is going to come, and when it comes to the United States, it's going to come faster when the gerontologists leave the stage. But they won't get it because it's not the world there was nothing wrong with branch banking to them, and you can't convince them otherwise. The time will just pass them by, and I don't mean disrespect, but I saw it myself in my own eyes as a kid, and it's repeating itself today.
I mean, just on your point about innovation, and to go back to sort of the companies operating in this space, right? Of the tokens, Mike, you mentioned this, the tokens that were named in the lawsuits, for example, some companies have now delisted those tokens. Some are saying we're not going to operate in the US anymore. Should other crypto trading firms be worried now that the SEC is also going to come for them if they are also running, say, Polygon, Solana tokens? And how are US companies thinking about operating in the country?
Yeah, I mean, in a word, yes. They should be very worried. I mean, that's one of the difficult problems with regulation by enforcement. There's no clear guidelines for them to come into compliance on these things. And so it's just sort of a one-off thing, and it's the ones that have been delisted, but I'm more worried about the ones that never get off the ground on this piece. And it's, you know, it's amazing. I mean, Chris, you know, being a former regulator, you know, probably asked, same as me, from a lot of people, is what's your advice in terms of somebody new in a new innovative space, you know, should they come to Washington, D.C.? And I've always said, yes, find out who your regulator is and go in, and your first meeting should be with them. It's just, hi, this is who I am, this is our business model. We don't have an ask. We just want to like tell you show who we are. We're going to be putting an application in at some point for this regulatory approval. Are there any questions? All that. And my advice always was do that from the beginning. When it comes to the crypto space, my advice is the opposite. Do not come to Washington, D.C. Do not get on the SEC's radar screen. Now, I know people are laughing, but that's very serious. To your point, right? It's people are scared about this stuff, and so I don't want to have to say that, but I feel like I have to give that advice.
Just to add on to that, not only is there, I think, a challenge, and we've lived through this, right, and being able to go in and try to talk about our business, and we've had a lot of challenges, obviously. But the other challenge is that not only are they not learning, but there's also a little-known fact that right now they can't actually own crypto. Anybody in the federal government can't work with crypto, they can't explore it. So how on earth do you know how to regulate it if you're not willing to meet with industry, or if you're willing to meet with them, it's much more with a gotcha mentality, and you can't actually explore the issues. Like that's insane when you try to think about creating a good model that has durability and can lead us into the future. So maybe that's another rule that needs to be fixed. Maybe we should add that to the legislation.
Well, so I have so when I was at the SEC back in 2013, I asked my ethics counsel if I could buy Bitcoin, and I was going to buy Bitcoin on there, and they said no. I said, well, why not? Is it a security? No. Well, why couldn't you do it? And so I keep track of this. Right now, I would have gotten 50x my money if I had bought this in 2013.
You wouldn't be sitting here.
And I would be a smarter regulator, to your point, too. But I'd also be 50 times richer.
So I want to add to this. So when I became chairman of the CFTC in 2017, we affirmatively said it's okay for our staff to own crypto, and we were lambasted in the press. But I thought, look, I don't have a problem with people own it, just disclose it. If you're working on a project, let us know if you own it and if you've got an interest. If I were to say you couldn't own Bitcoin, then how could I let them own gold? Because we deal with gold futures. How can I let them eat wheat? Because we deal with wheat futures, right? So of course they could own crypto. It made them better. We did something else at the CFTC when I was there. We created something called Lab CFTC for the very reason that Karen and Mike are talking about. Innovators would come to us and they'd want to talk about what they're doing. And we didn't have the in-house expertise to go with them blow by blow to understand the technology. So what we did was we got a terrific head, Daniel Gorfine, and we built around him a team of people with technical chops that understood it. All of them owned crypto. And that was the starting point for a dialogue with the agencies to make us smarter. And a little known fact is in the summer of 2017, so that's a long time ago, we were doing synthetic Bitcoin mining in the chairman's conference room at the CFTC to understand what mining was all about. I can tell you hands down, no other government agency in 2017 or even today has done any Bitcoin mining to understand it, and yet they're making rules on it, they're enforcing it.
Kari, you're nodding.
I think that that's exactly right. And we lived through the benefit actually of Lab CFTC and had those very productive conversations. And I think that the goal of having people who are technical experts and the people who have an open mind or are willing to do this, I think that's really important. I think it also highlights that there is an increasing oversight on the agencies right now for how they are engaging with the industry. I think that will continue because, and maybe it's wishful thinking, but I think that that's the kind of increased scrutiny that will say, okay, we don't have the technical expertise, you don't have the willingness to bring people in and actually find a path forward. I think that congressional oversight will help with that kind of maybe not so gentle nudge to move in the right direction.
Yeah, and kudos to Chris. If you look at the newest bill that was introduced, they're codifying Lab CFTC.
Exactly.
On that, and they're saying this is an important part, and they're actually redefining the missions of the agency to include innovation as a specific statutory mission of the agencies.
And Chris, I want to touch on something that you mentioned earlier in looking at other regulatory regimes. When you look at Europe, for example, when you look at Hong Kong, how much is the US at risk of falling behind, and the US companies at risk of falling behind?
So the thing that needs to be admitted out loud is they are very aware of where we are today, and they don't have a great deal of respect for it. They see us as missing a step right now, and they see it as an opportunity for them to gain a step. Everybody around the world is aware of how much advantage the US got from dominating the first wave of the internet. The tech companies that came out of that have been, equity leaders for the last 25 years. So every one of our economic adversaries and economic competitors see the US stumbling right now as an opportunity to gain advantage. And so that doesn't mean the rules they're writing or the legal frameworks they're putting forward are perfect. They've got issues. I've certainly got some concerns with some of the EUs. It's very, well, I won't get into it, but they're not all perfect, but give them an A for effort. Give them an A for seeing the competitive advantage, and give us a D- for allowing this to happen. We should be the very best students of how much advantage we got from what we did 25 years ago, and that should be the model for what we're doing today. And unfortunately, it's not. We're in a completely different, I would call it un-American phase right now, where we're suppressing innovation rather than furthering it. And when the tide turns, and the tide will always turn, the pendulum swings, we're going to have to catch up. The rest of the world wanted to catch up to us what we did last time. Now we're going to have to catch up to other places. And that seems to me just so un-American.
Yeah, I mean, other jurisdictions, right? You go to the UAE, both Abu Dhabi and Dubai. I mean, the amount of, Abu Dhabi and Dubai, the competition among those is very, very healthy. And they have world-class regulators at those places, right? They have from all over developed markets all around the world and stuff. And they make it. They're embracing the innovative firms that come in. And I was just there in November for a conference that we held, and I went from one American firm to another in the same building, and people were just setting up shop there because that's a place where they can actually grow their business and innovate.
But in every one of those countries, they are actually, and this is what I find so fascinating, they're actually trying to create high bars for regulation.
Yes.
And that's where the companies are going. They're not fleeing to low regulatory burdens. They're actually looking for quality, and that's what I think has been fascinating here. And most of the conversations in all those different places are the same. They're asking the same types of questions, right? Because new technology is creating new markets, new expectations, new needs, and that's why it's so fascinating in the U.S. where we say no new rules are needed. And yet you have to look everywhere else is just underscoring that new rules are needed. And that's not crazy, and it shouldn't scare people. We should actually leap into it because that, to your point, that keeps us ahead. But to say we just don't need new rules, there are 20 other countries who would beg to differ.
Yeah.
You're nodding, yeah.
No,
yeah.
I agree. I mean, again, I've spoken to these overseas regulators directly, and they'll reveal to me that they know where the U.S. is right now, and they see this as an opportunity.
And with where the US is right now, there are various bills. There's one going through the House of Representatives on crypto and stablecoin regulation. What do you make of that? And what do you make of sort of how long it will take to get sort of in the US something clear, this regulatory clarity that everyone's clamoring for?
I think there's a very good chance that these bills pass the House this year. I had the chance to speak to Chairman McHenry. He believes he's got support in his caucus, but he also is working very hard to get bipartisan support so it's not a partisan bill. And when you've got the support of your caucus, that actually gives you a much stronger hand to play with the minority because you can say, look, I can pass it, so come on board now and make it your own and get in. And so they're going about this, I think, in the right way. It was fairly unprecedented for two rivaling committees, the Financial Services and the Ag Committee, one oversees the SEC, the other one oversees the CFTC, to come out with companion bills that marry up very well. That was a sign of the thoughtfulness, the intelligence that went into it. At my hearing, along with Paul, we heard from Democratic leadership that were very supportive of the legislation that had been put forward. I think for the political reasons, the voting reasons, the audience for this skews younger, that you're going to get support on both sides of the aisle. So I think a very good chance. Now, that's the House. There's an old saying in the House that your political opponents in the House are your adversaries, but the Senate's your enemy. And so I don't know if they're the enemy to reform here. Sherrod Brown, the chairman of the House Senate Banking Committee, has got a tough re-election fight. I don't know how this fight figures into that. But I don't think the Senate is in the same place that the House is. But I do think there's a good chance of it passing the House this year. That doesn't mean it becomes law, but I think that's a pretty important statement about the growing political support for smart. And just in the longer term, we will get this right in the United States. I have no doubt we will get this right. And when the pendulum swings back, it'll come back forcefully. We will move forward with this. But we're in this stalemate now, yes. And we do need the legislation. I think we'll get it, but it's going to take some time.
Yeah, no, Chris is absolutely right. I mean, trying to get this stuff through, it is three-dimensional chess. It's not just Democrats versus Republicans, and then you add to that the jurisdictions, and then the House versus the Senate dynamic. Chairman McHenry, I think, has made the best possible choices to give this the best chance to get through by not trying to do one comprehensive bill to try to solve everything. For example, the stablecoin legislation is different than sort of the other broader crypto market structure legislation is what they're calling it. It seems like the stablecoin legislation, it's trending towards giving that to a banking regulator. And then the stablecoin to the other crypto to one of the markets regulator. And then there's also the tax piece that he's leaving out separately to deal with because that has to go through a third committee, the Ways and Means Committee or the Senate Finance Committee. So he's giving this the best chance to go forward. And then to your point, things, I used to work in the Senate. So the Senate is where a lot of House things go to die. But again, it has to be pressure from either top down from the administration, which they're sort of tepid on this stuff right now. They haven't weighed in, so that's one way to get through. when I was in the Senate, we had something called the Jobs Act, where we had a divided House and a Senate and a Democratic president, and that was able to get through because President Obama made it a priority, worked with House Republicans, got it through. The other way is the bottom-up approach, where senators now have to hear from their constituents to make this a particular issue go through. So constituents from Ohio, where Senator Sherrod Brown is from, are the ones that need to really voice their.
Turns out we were in Columbus last week. I think that in the Senate, I also worked in the Senate, and it's really hard. Legislation, getting it across the finish line, you can have legislation that takes 15 years. I worked on privacy legislation back in 2002, 2003, and they're still working on it. So I think that it's really hard, and I think one thing that we always talk about is if you want to kill a bill, you can do it with one party. You can do it in a partisan fashion and you can kill it. If you want to get something across the finish line, it has to be bipartisan, and you have to be thinking about that 3 steps early. And that's, I think, what McHenry and Thompson are trying to do, is bring along the Democrats, and I'm very hopeful that we will actually have some very thoughtful Democrats come to the table and provide some really, I think, some good ideas on improving consumer protection and investor protection and thinking through innovation and why we need it. So I do have high hopes for the House. In the Senate, I've been in DC for 23 years. They paid me to be an optimist. I think that there is a path. It's a narrow path before the end of the year. It's a narrow path before the election. But before the end of this Congress, I actually do have some confidence that we will find a path forward on legislation that will address CFTC spot authority, or any kind of regulatory effort, I think, to allow for commodities and tokens that have utility and are decentralized to be regulated by the CFTC. I think you'll have something for the SEC. I do think tax will be addressed we have a tax bill almost every year. They'll do something along that. Maybe it's coupled with some other restrictions. And then I think in terms of stablecoins, that's the one big priority of the administration. That's what we've seen in the executive order. We've seen that in the President's Working Group report, known as the PwC or PWG report, not PricewaterhouseCoopers, President Working Group. They had a report that basically said we've got to address stablecoins. So I think if you've got the administration pushing in one area, even one, a rule of legislating is generally nothing goes unless everything goes, because nobody wants to let somebody else get a win. So oftentimes that's how you get Christmas trees, and that's how they die of their own weight. But sometimes, just sometimes, you can piece together the 4 different, in this instance is 4 different pieces: tax, stablecoins, market structure, or CFTC and SEC. There's a path forward. It just may not all happen at once. And every step, though, is critically important, because every single step demonstrates that these rules need updating. They need modernizing, and all of the ideas that are going to come to the fore are going to be really important. They're going to be important for market participants to understand what people care about, what Congress cares about, how we need to be thinking about structuring our business, and how we need to be working with regulators, and then how the rest of the ecosystem is going to grow up. So I think that it could happen. Does it happen this year? Very, very tiny window.
And we talked a lot about, I guess, the creators of the crypto in terms of coins and companies trading. But what about the asset management and the hedge fund side of things, and how they should be regulated, how regulation affects them? Because, I guess a lot of people in this room, a lot of people more broadly are, on the last panel, for example, talking about sort of interested in crypto, want to get involved, but are afraid, essentially. They don't want to get hit by regulation or by enforcement action or anything of the sort. How should these asset managers, hedge funds, think about regulation, and how does that sort of play into these conversations?
So what I've discovered in the last, I've been working for Coinbase since 2016, and I think when we primarily, and still obviously, focus on retail, but retail investors have one set, I think, concerns. Institutional grade, institutional investors, I think, have a set of other concerns. Mm-hmm. And what we have found, and what I've discovered in this job now, is that with the inclusion of institutional investors, it's actually brought a lot of credibility. Because institutional investors, when you onboard, you have a very high bar for trust. You have a very high bar for how we operate. You want to institute as a company the protections and the conflicts of interests and all of the things that you have to do to be a financial institution. Frankly, the institutional investors are imposing on crypto companies, on exchanges, and that's a good thing, because it's actually bringing the level up. And so I think in DC, when we have conversations, not only are we a public company, and that is actually a benefit, despite Mr. Gensler maybe not recognizing that we're a public company sometimes. Really, at the end of the day, like all of the influx of institutional investors and I think the high standards that you bring is really valuable to Coinbase, it's valuable to the ecosystem, it's valuable to regulators, and that's why I think if we continue, as you all look at this and as you think about the policy, urge you to get engaged, because I think that this is an asset class that has immense promise, and I think you probably wouldn't be sitting in this room if you didn't also agree with that to an extent. So as you think about how you engage with policymakers, would urge you, I'm always available, please reach out to me, can help you with any member, any kind of question, but that's where I see institutional investors and hedge funds and others really coming to bear.
Yeah, I'll make a point that's not directly related to crypto, but the governing consensus in our financial markets for the last 30, 40 years was that the retail side of financial services was fairly heavily regulated, and the wholesale side had a lot of self-regulation and had a lighter touch form of regulation on the basis that retail investors were not exposed to it and big players can take care of themselves. One of the criticisms of that system was that it kept retail participants out of some of the best opportunities. And certainly when I was in Washington alongside Jay Clayton, one of his initiatives as chairman was to try to allow more retail investors to get into some of these early stage opportunities investors. It seems to be now there's a growing movement in Washington not to address that piece that keeps retail investors out of the better wholesale. It's to bring the wholesale side into some of the same regulatory frameworks that exist on the retail side. And I think we're going about this the wrong way. We're expanding government reach, but we're not giving the retail people that would like access to some of the better opportunities, in a society that treasures economic growth, greater emancipation of people to participate in the financial system. We're actually not empowering that. What we're doing is bringing a greater swath of institutional and wholesale participants under Washington regulation and all that comes with it. And so I think that this is something that people should reflect on and perhaps push back on. The real issue is giving retail investors greater opportunity and not restricting them from opportunities.
Well, I'll give you an example. In the crypto space is, there's been a number of firms that have applied for exchange-traded funds with the SEC to be able to trade crypto underlying with a fiduciary duty under the Investment Company Investment Advisors Act. And so far, the only one that the SEC has approved has been the ones involved, ETFs involved in Bitcoin futures contract. And thanks to Chris, when he was at the CFTC, allowed for Bitcoin futures contracts to be traded. And so, the SEC's approach to that is saying, look, we're comfortable with the regulator of the underlying thing, which is a Bitcoin futures contract. And so they were able to let that go. And there was so much pressure for the SEC to let that go. Now you're seeing, wanting to do spot Bitcoin and maybe some other things that are involved, and they've sort of drawn this line and said that, but you're seeing more pressure now, right? It was Grayscale was the first one to really fight this. There was multiple before, like 20 of them before them. They're fighting now. You've got BlackRock centered, and then Wisdom Tree, I think, just entered, and you're getting more and more of this. I think we're going to see more and more pressure for that, and that is, that's a well-established since the 1940s regulatory framework to protect investors with a fiduciary duty.
For people in the audience that may be hoping for a Bitcoin ETF on the spot market, the best way to get that done is to support the legislation that we give the CFTC oversight of the spot market, because now the SEC would no longer have an objection that the underlying market is not regulated and let that ETF go.
We've only got a few minutes left, so I just want to ask each of you, Cara, starting with you, are you going to win against the SEC? And what is the ideal in terms of both that, but more broadly, regulatory clarity? What does that mean? What does that look like ideally?
So we very much believe the facts are on our side in this case. And we will, as you've heard Brian talk about, you've heard, again, my chief legal officer, my chief policy officer, Farr talk about that we do think the facts are on our side. And we will take this to the extent that we need to try to find a resolution. What does winning look like? I think winning looks like a market framework that works not just for Coinbase, but for all of the market participants. and allows for innovators and other builders to bring their market or bring their products and services to the marketplace. That's, I think, what winning looks like for us. We want to get to 1 billion people using crypto. That's a big goal, right? And how do you do that worldwide? That means you need to have consistent and harmonized frameworks around the world, and you need to have something that people can trust. And so we really need to make sure that the United States comes to it urgently and does it in a way that provides a durable, long-lasting solution for really everybody.
Chris, same question. What does it look like?
Yeah, so what winning looks like to me, something we've got a lot of experience in, because we won the first wave of the Internet of Information. Winning is probably the wrong phrase, but we dominated, and we brought American values to that, of open architectures, of open information, of not government suppressing. That's changed a little bit in the last few years, but the notion of an internet of freely traded information. So winning is the United States to play that same role in an internet of value. If we're going to adopt an architecture that allows us to record value on digital networks, private and public, as opposed to what we've done for the last 400 years, record value on the balance sheets of proprietary commercial institutions called banks and other financial service players. If we're to put it on a network, that's an opportunity to bring our values to the table, values of privacy, of lack of censorship, of financial inclusion, of lower costs, lower rent seeking, of free market economics. So winning will be the United States bringing those unique values to the development of this innovation. And losing is by resisting it, allowing other nations to put their values on. And while our friends in Europe have some of the same values, our friends in Asia have very different values of government surveillance, government control. And so losing is missing this opportunity. Winning is seizing this opportunity.
We're running out of time, but in one sentence.
I can't top that on winning the war on this. But let me just talk just very quickly for 30 seconds on one battle that we haven't talked about here, right? So Coinbase has obviously been on the defense, but one battle where they're going on the offense that I think is a particularly fruitful way to go, and it was I loved seeing was that Coinbase has been, as Cara mentioned, they had their proposal out there. They actually have a petition for rulemaking at the SEC. And the SEC is required to respond to that. It can be thank you, no. It can be, oh, we're thinking about it, whatever it is. But the SEC has never responded to it. So they've recently filed what's called a writ of mandamus in the court to say to the court, like, please force the SEC to tell us their answer. And it's beautiful. They basically say in there, like, we already know the answer is no, but you're basically stalling us from potential additional judicial review, which is your right to petition the government. I'd love to see what that judicial review is, what the next stage of the battle is, but they're basically stuck. And by the SEC not moving, it's foregoing your opportunity to get redress against the government, the overbearing government in this case. And so I'm watching that one with a lot of joy and actually and optimism that to actually get to start moving forward and battle this out.
Yep.
So.
Well, and I'll let you close out, but on that point about the petition, it really was about like very specific issues because they are very specific, and the fact that they can't answer very specific questions, I think is exactly what we're trying to get to the bottom of. So
we've got to keep our eyes peeled.
Yes, we're laser focused.
Well, great. Thank you all so much. We're out of time. Thank you very much for coming.